so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be here and to bring some of what we've been doing up in the Columbia River headwaters down to Nelson. I don't think that happens often enough, so I'm really excited to share some of what we've been doing down here with you folks. Although I recognize that people from all over, but probably most of you are from the southern part of the basin. And my name is Rachel Darvill, and if any of you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to ask as we go through it. So first, to give you a brief overview for what I hope to speak with you guys about today, first I'll give you a brief introduction to the Columbia Wetlands. So I'll speak to some of the significant ecological values that the wetland has, as well as speak to some of the different conservation tools and designations that the wetlands currently hold. Then I'll speak to some of the our major goals of the Columbia Wetlands Waterbird survey. Then I'll speak to why we would want to monitor waterbirds in the first place. So what are sort of our major goals there, and why would we want to do that? And then I'll speak to some of our major accomplishments to date. So the program just really got on the ground this spring, but we have been working on it for the past year or so in terms of doing some preliminary groundwork, and then we've launched the survey just recently. So I'll speak to all of the accomplishments to date, or some of the major ones at least, and then I'll speak to some of the preliminary results. So we just had our first spring survey, and the dates were April 24th, April 29th, and May 4th. And I'll provide you with some of the preliminary results that we've had coming in. And then I'll finish off with what's next for the Columbia Wetlands Waterbird Survey. So the Columbia Wetlands, I'm not sure how many of you guys have been up to the Columbia Wetlands and know some of what I'm talking about. Okay, so quite a few, most of you have been up to the headwaters, so that's really fantastic and not really all that surprising, given that we all live in the Columbia Basin and this is the source of the Columbia River. And the Columbia Wetlands is one of the longest intact continuous wetland systems in all of North America, and it is the only undammed stretch of Columbia River that remains. So there are 14 dams on the Columbia River system, on the main stem of the Columbia River, and a number of smaller dams on tributaries of the Columbia. And the Columbia Wetlands begins in Canal Flats and extends for approximately 180 kilometers. So it ends around the Donald area, which is about 20 kilometers north of Golden. And it's 3 to 5 kilometers across, depending on where you are. So it's this pretty massive wetland system. And there are two major lake systems within the headwaters as well, Lake Windermere and Columbia Lake. And the Columbia Wetlands are very significant for its biodiversity values. So it provides habitat for numerous wildlife and fish species. It's very significant for a number of different migratory and resident birds. And it is considered to be a vital part of the Pacific Flyway during the spring and fall migrations. The wetlands are also known to have the second highest known density of nesting osprey in British Columbia, as well as the second highest known density for nesting great blue herons within Western Canada. And wetlands globally, not just the Columbia Wetland System, but all over the world, are considered to be one of the most productive habitats that we have on our planet. And numerous ecosystem services are provided by wetlands. So an ecosystem services is increasingly this term that we're seeing being used in North America. It's really being used as a concept in other countries, especially in European nations. And ecosystem services can be considered as all of those benefits that humans acquire from nature, and they're necessary to maintain in order for human well-being to persist into the future. And so different ecosystem services that a wetland would provide would be things like aesthetic views, recreational services, cultural values, sense of place, but also things like carbon sequestration, water filtration and water purification, flood protection. There's a number of services from the wetland. So, the Columbia Wetlands is a Ramsar site. It was designated as such in 2004, meaning that it has been recognized as a wetland with international significance. The majority of it is comprised as a wildlife management area, which means that it's managed primarily for its wildlife values, but other compatible uses can take place. And the wildlife management area portion is managed by the provincial government, Flinro. And then there's 4 national wildlife areas as well, kind of really small parcels of national wildlife area, which is managed by Environment Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service. And those are in Wilmer, Spilmishy, Briscoe, and Harrogate. And then it's part of the Yellowstone-Yukon corridor, meaning that it's very important to maintain for large carnivore movements as well. And there are a few different laws in place right now. One is that there are no land-based vehicles allowed in the wetlands, so no ATVs in the summer months and no snowmobiles or any sort of motorized vehicle like that in the winter months when the wetlands are frozen. Motorized boats are currently restricted to only the main channel, so they're not allowed into the wetland sloughs or any of these, mainly to protect birds, things like the grebes, like this horn grebe that you see up on the screen there on the top, because they create these floating nests, and wake boats can flood those nests. And also the motorized boats on the main channel are not allowed to have any towing activities, so things like wakeboards or water skis. There are some private lands, and although there are quite a lot of amazing different conservation tools for the Columbia wetlands, it is not formally protected in that it's not a park protected area or an ecological reserve. And thus, the Columbia Wetlands Waterbird Survey was created. So one of the major goals of the Columbia Wetlands Waterbird Survey is to collect some useful baseline data in order to hopefully obtain an additional conservation status known as an important bird area. And I'll get to what that is in our next slide after we go through the rest of the goals. And again, if anyone has any questions, I know I'm spewing out a lot of information here, please feel free to just raise your hand at any time. So the second major goal is to develop and initiate a coordinated bird count using citizen scientists, and then to create this large-scale, long-term citizen science opportunity for Columbia Valley residents. So especially in the northern part of, yeah?
I have a question, number 3. What do you mean by create a long-term citizen science opportunity?
So we're collecting all of this baseline data, and we're doing that using citizen scientists. So we're collecting the baseline data on waterbirds.
Who's collecting it?
Citizen scientists. So anybody can participate in the survey.
Okay.
Anybody.
Citizens, right?
Yeah.
People? Okay. That's what I was asking. Local people?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Columbia Valley residents. So people that live there, anyone can participate, and we're training them to become these citizen science volunteers. And we also aim to build increased appreciation and awareness and recognition for the Columbia wetland system, as well as for the birds that rely upon the wetlands as critical habitat.
Rachel, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the training that you're giving them, is it similar to, are you using what sort of recognized protocols are you using to count birds?
So I wasn't going to get into the exact protocol because that would be a lot more information.
Okay.
But basically, in a nutshell, and I think this will be covered as we go, but we've got these training modules where we delivered one in Golden and one in Invermere, and people came to learn all about the protocol, so exactly what to do when we're out there. And we're monitoring these birds during the spring and fall migrations, 3 dates in the spring, 3 dates in the fall, and we're all up there at the exact same time, on the exact same dates, and so that we're not double counting any birds. And we're covering 60 different sites in the Columbia Wetland Complex thus far. And so, for instance, this spring we had 37 different volunteers out there at these 60 sites collecting information on all the birds that were on the wetlands, sites that we could access. So there's definitely some monitoring gaps there, but the training module taught people about the protocol, when to collect the data, where to collect the data, and also how to identify waterbirds. So we train them with that as well, in a nutshell.
You don't have to be a biologist then?
No, anyone can participate. So we've also developed this field bird guide. I should have brought some. I actually did bring some, but they're in my car. I'll get them at lunch so you can see them. And we've just really highlighted the 40 birds that you're most likely to see in the Columbia wetlands, so that people don't have to feel really intimidated. You know, when people ask you to participate in a bird survey, I think some people can feel really intimidated and overwhelmed because you pick up a regular field guide and there's 300 birds in there. And we're not asking people to learn how to recognize those 300 birds. We just are really trying to get people to know these 40 birds that you're most likely to see during the spring migration for the water birds only. And these birds are relatively easy to identify compared to something like a songbird, or warblers or sparrows. They're much harder to identify. So if people can just learn to recognize these 40, that's fantastic. And so far we've had some novice birders come in and they've been able to do a really great job.
Rachel,
Yeah.
what particular dates is this survey being conducted?
So the spring surveys were April 24th, 29th, and May 4th. And then the fall surveys will be October 5th, 15th, and 25th. Yeah, and we hope to run this survey for at least 5 consecutive years. Okay, so an important bird area. Why would we want to obtain this? Well, I did allude to the fact that it is a significant conservation tool. And this is really a global science-based initiative that works to identify, monitor, and conserve a network of sites across the world that provide essential habitat for birds. So if we're able to do this throughout the world and work towards conserving these sites and make sure that they have legal designations in place, then this ensures a healthy future for our world's birds. And if we have this important bird area IBA status, then it recognizes that these particular places are really irreplaceable for birds. They're the most important places. And so it holds that significant conservation value in terms of really scientifically proving that they're very important and critical for birds. And because it is globally recognized, there's 10,000 of these sites globally, 600 across Canada, and I believe 84 in British Columbia. It's this conservation currency that transcends international borders. Everyone understands what it is, especially if you're involved with bird conservation. And it promotes the international collaboration and coordination for the conservation of our world's birds. And in order to obtain this IBA, we need to meet 1% of the continental or global threshold in terms of the number of species. So for instance, give you an example, if we were able to see 340 trumpeter swans on one of our survey dates, April 24th, for instance, then that would trigger this IBA. So we would, and if we were able to see that for 5 consecutive years, then we would be able to obtain this important bird area status for the Columbia Wetlands. So it's not an easy designation to obtain, but it's definitely doable for the Columbia Wetlands, and that's been recognized by different agencies such as Ducks Unlimited and Canadian Wildlife Service.
Rachel, I have a quick question. So
Yeah.
how does it compare in terms of policy implementation to have IBA designation versus Ramsar? Because we've seen that Ramsar doesn't necessarily change policy and management.
So right now in Canada, an IBA status is very similar to Ramsar in that it recognizes its significant conservation values, but it's not a formal level of protection currently. In other countries it is. And IBA is a relatively new thing in Canada, and I know that the people that work on IBA, Bird Studies Canada, BC Nature, and other agencies are working towards having the IBA mean more for official conservation designations, but currently it is very similar to a Ramsar status, but it is another significant conservation tool. So why would we want to monitor waterbirds in addition to trying to obtain this important bird area status? Well, there are numerous threats to wetland birds, including habitat loss, climate change. Train derailments is a real possibility for us in the Columbia Wetlands, given that railway spans the entire length of our waters in the Columbia Wetlands. Invasive species introductions, both terrestrial and aquatic, and thanks to Columbia Basin Trust and other organizations, the invasive species councils, invasive species problems are starting to really gain traction and awareness and much more attention, so that's really fantastic. And thus far we have no aquatic invasive species introductions that we're aware of in the Columbia headwaters. Water pollution is another potential threat, as well as different disturbances that are increasing from things like boats, increasing predators, and I should say boats, both motorized and non-motorized. So these types of things are occurring, but we really don't have any idea what's going on with our bird populations, our water bird populations in the wetlands. So it's going to be very difficult for us to ascertain how these threats are impacting our birds if we have no baseline data to begin with. So if we're able to collect this baseline data on species, abundance, distribution, and their long-term population trends. If we were to have something like, for instance, a train derailment occur in the wetlands, we would know what we had before, and then we can monitor the change after to see how much that particular impact actually had on the population of birds. And it's useful for a number of other things as well. So data can be useful for formulating management actions. So for instance, if we were able to find this really productive slough that had a number of different waterbird species and a good diverse population, and we actually saw it going down, the population's going down, well then we could look around and see what's going on and then maybe make some changes and develop some specific management actions to try to increase the health of the water and of the birds that rely upon that particular water source. We can also do things like put things like development permit areas into official community plans for areas that have been recognized as being very sensitive habitat for bird populations, and this has been done in some areas of British Columbia already, but on the coast. And data collection can really help foster appreciation for wetlands and for bird conservation. So if you're able to get people involved in citizen science initiatives that wouldn't normally have the opportunity, the know-how, or the desire to do so, if you're able to get them involved, that can really help them to develop this sense of ownership and passion and awareness of why these wetlands are important. Yeah.
I could just add that the development permit area tool is starting to gain traction in the Columbia Basin on like Windermere. It's being used in OCPs to protect shoreline habitat for birds. So it's
Excellent.
starting to.
I didn't know that. That's good to know. Very good to know. Okay, yes, Claire?
Rachel, I just had a question. Are any of the birds you guys are monitoring species at risk?
Yes.
And with that answer of yes, are you going to try to upload that data to IMAP so people who are dealing in land conservation can access that information to help guide where they're acquiring land?
Yeah. So definitely.
Awesome.
Well, not IMAP in particular necessarily, although I will look into that, but all of the data is currently available on eBird, which is this globally used database for bird information, and I've already been speaking with some land trust organizations, and I definitely will be a lot more in the future about all the data that we acquire, and specifically about the different information that we have on threatened birds and endangered birds, definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hi.
I was just wondering how you were going to select your sites. Just will you be mostly looking for high-quality sites, or will you be looking at sort of impacted sites as well?
So we've already selected a number of our sites, and we did that in sort of our preliminary phase, but because we had overwhelming interest in this survey, I actually had hoped for 15 or 20 participants, and we had almost 50 people want to volunteer. So in the last few weeks, we're scrambling to find more sites. And really, it was just anything that's accessible, because we want to cover the entire wetland complex. And if you're familiar with the Columbia wetlands, most of it is largely inaccessible. So basically, anywhere that somebody can get into the wetlands and view a slough that has birds, or even if it doesn't have birds, because zero presence is actually good data as well. We're looking at all of the sites that we can possibly access. And then now, because we do have such a large amount of participants in the survey, we're looking to have boat access areas as well, using canoes and kayaks in some of these more inaccessible areas. Because all of our accessible locations are pretty much covered.
As well, I mean, are you going to recruit outreach ambassadors to access communities around the wetlands?
In terms of providing like educational materials.
That's
and
right. Yeah.
So we are already doing that. We have been delivering presentations to different and varied interest groups throughout the Columbia Valley, and we're going to continue to do that. For instance, we just delivered a presentation to the Wetland Keepers Workshop in Radium a couple days ago. We've given quite a few presentations already, and I'll be speaking to that coming up as well, or maybe I'll skip through it now because I'm going to talk to it now. But also, we've developed a bird education program for school kids as well in the Golden area, and we'd like to expand that throughout the entire Columbia Basin. So bring all the educators together and train them with this bird education program to then bring it back to their schools, both the importance of birds and wetlands, because we can obviously find both of those things throughout the entire basin.
So I have another question, because I mean, it's a great program.
Thank you.
Obviously, you guys are doing excellent work, but it also seems a bit redundant, because we already know and have known for a couple of decades now the value in terms of birds and wetlands in the upper basin there, the headwaters, and so I'm wondering why it's not just a policy-driven program as opposed to a citizen science program. Why we can't, reveal what we already know to policymakers and make these kinds of designation and find areas for protection that should be pretty much an easy sell.
Because we actually lack the data. We don't actually have that data. And so we did fill out an application to try to get the Columbia Wetlands recognized as an important bird area.
Uh-huh.
And they went and looked at all the data that's available, and there is an incredibly minimal amount of data on birds in the Columbia Wetlands and for biodiversity in general. It's quite shocking. And so as you would know, it's pretty impossible to get anything happening unless you actually have the science to prove that it's worthy of protection. So that's why.
So
we've
what
been
about
looking.
local government? Are they involved?
So we're just starting to get all the local governments hopefully on board. So the Columbia Shuswap Regional District is definitely 100% on board, and we're going to be presenting to the Regional District of the East Kootenay this summer, and hopefully they will also be on board. Town of Golden is, and then same District of Invermere and the Village of Radium will have presentations asking for their support as well.
So are you concerned about imminent threat?
About what?
Imminent threat?
Imminent threat?
Yeah, I mean, like,
From
in
terrorists?
terms of, you know, like, yeah. No, I was thinking, I mean, like, obviously, you're moving in this direction because you want to protect, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, is there something on the horizon here that, that's motivating you? I mean,
No.
you talked about the possibility of train,
Well, that could happen anytime.
yeah. So nothing that's looking imminent? that
No,
you're-
I'm not thinking, oh, there's some proposal coming up and I'm
Right.
wanting to collect the data. No,
Yeah.
not at all. No. Okay? I think three? Okay.
I have more.
Yep.
Let me get one. So, Rachel, you mentioned earlier there about invasive species.
Mhm.
Are you currently monitoring? Because I know how important wetlands are for invasive species.
Yeah.
Are you currently monitoring yourself, or do you have somebody with invasive council doing it, or what?
No, I've been monitoring a lot of the water bodies in the Columbia headwaters for 6 or 7 years now. So I've monitored pretty much all of the lakes on the west bench there, if you're familiar with that, that would end up draining into the wetlands. And I've been monitoring Lake Windermere for aquatic invasive plants for 6 or 7 years now, and I do that on an annual basis. And I've been monitoring Columbia Lake for a few years, and I've monitored some sites in the Columbia wetlands because migratory birds can bring in invasive species as well. But because of a limited, amount of resources in all different ways, we feel like it's most important to continue to monitor Lake Windermere because it has the highest possibility for bringing in these aquatic invasive species. And so that's why the aquatic invasive plant inventories continue to occur on Lake Windermere and not annually and not in these other places. But it would be good to revisit all of these places every 3 years or so for aquatic invasive plant introductions because things like birds can actually bring them in. But we haven't been able to identify any aquatic invasive plant species in the northern part of the basin thus far.
Okay, not just plants, but aquatic.
Yeah, there has, and for mussels, we've done a tiny bit of that in Lake Windermere, but not very much. But the East Kootenay Invasive Plant Council is going to start doing more mussel monitoring in Lake Windermere and the surrounding lakes starting this summer, I believe, or potentially this fall. And in terms of fish and snails and frogs and these types of things, I haven't heard of any, but it's never actually been done. The monitoring hasn't been done for those particular species. And I'm not sure if the invasive plant or species councils are going to be doing those particular species or not. I think their focus is going to be on aquatic mussels at first, at least.
Because that's high traffic area when you're here with a
Yeah.
lot of people coming in with boats, and you know the situation right now, with people transporting, right?
Yeah.
So there doesn't seem to be, they are getting geared up for it, and the question was, I was more concerned about aquatic, like the restriction or education of people importing.
Yeah, and that's going to, again, the Columbia Basin Trust has just put a large amount of funding and effort into aquatic invasive species for the Columbia Basin, and a new aquatic, this is totally going off topic, but an aquatic invasive species strategy has just been developed for the basin, and the different invasive plant committees have been tasked with really going out and educating and promoting more awareness around these, and there's these boat washing stations now that are going to be, there's going to be 3 of them in the basin, and they're going to be going to different events. And yeah, so finally, the education and awareness around these major threats are starting to happen.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, I'll try to fly through the rest of this presentation. I don't know what time it is, but I'm sure I'm over my time. Okay, so yes, we've collected baseline data on waterbirds at 60 different sites. All the data is into eBird. We've recruited, coordinated, and trained 37 different participants for these spring surveys, in addition to 12 more participants through Wings of the Rockies on the last date. There's 8 that we have on a waiting list, and we were able to get some funding to buy high optical equipment for our participants, so scopes, tripods, these types of things, so everyone has the same gear. We have been doing a lot of outreach, so we've had these training modules that we've done for our participants. We've developed the field guide, and there's the cover of the field guide there. I'll bring some in at lunch if you're interested. We've been doing a number of presentations, working with media as much as possible, and Wings Over the Rockies has been amazing with helping us promote this event. Wild Voices for Kids, Columbia Basin, CBWN, or Columbia Basin Environmental Education Network, Wild Voices for Kids program, we've collaborated with them in offering bird field trips to kids. So this spring we had 6 field trips where we brought kids outside to show them birds and to teach them about birds and the importance of wetlands, as well as 5 in-classroom sessions the day previous to the field trips. And we were able to reach 133 kids this spring. And we're continually working on forming valuable partnerships. Can't do it all immediately, but we've been speaking with a number of different agencies, including these listed here. A lot of acronyms. If you want me to go through them, let me know. And these are some of our preliminary results. So I'm sure you're all aware that spring came really shockingly early this year. Like February, I think spring started for us. So unfortunately, we missed the peak of the migration by probably 5 days. So that was a major drag, let me tell you. But we still did manage to get some great data. So we managed to count over 6,000 individual birds on that first date. 58 checklists thus far have been submitted. There's a couple more still coming in. 76 different species, but the birds did go down. So like I mentioned, the peak was 5 days previous. I'm sure we could have captured a number of more birds. So next year, I think, because if climate change predictions are accurate, I don't suspect we'll be getting spring later as we go. That'll probably continue to be earlier. So we'll probably have the dates April 19th, 24th, and 29th for next year.
Rachel,
And yeah.
quick question on the checklist, 58 checklists. So does that mean 58 different surveys of 58 different people?
Well, 37 participants, and because there were so many participants, and it's also better to have 2 people at each survey for safety reasons and for more ears and eyes. There were 58 different sites this represents 58 different sites, but there are a couple more coming in, and 37 people. Most of them are doubled up, but not all.
That's impressive for one day.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Way to go.
But there's a lot of gaps, so there's actually more birds than that. And again, if we could capture the peak, I think we can really obtain this IBA. These are some of our trigger species. We've got the horned grebe up on the top left, hooded merganser in the top right, trumpeter swans in the middle, ruddy duck is the one with the blue bill, and the pie-billed grebe, and there's a few others as well. So we have these birds in pretty good numbers, and so we think that these will enable us to have the best potential to obtain the threshold to obtain this important bird area status. Lewis's woodpecker, you may notice, definitely not a waterbird, but we're very interested in monitoring Lewis's woodpeckers as well, in partnership with Environment Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service, because it's a threatened bird under Environment Canada's or the Federal Species at Risk Act. And if we're able to identify even 8 of these individuals on any given day, then this will trigger important bird area status. And we do have not a big population, but we have a population of Lewis's woodpeckers in the East Kootenays that we think would enable us to trigger that IBA. So next, we'll be doing these Lewis's woodpecker surveys in June and July, again in partnership with Canadian Wildlife Service. We're going to continue to provide resources and learning opportunities, work on accessing some of these more inaccessible sites, collaborate with additional and the same varied interests and relevant agencies. And because there is this incredible amount of interest, it's amazing. It's been way more work because we didn't expect so many people to want to be involved, but it's fantastic. And so we want more people to get involved. And so we're thinking of potentially developing more citizen science opportunities around birds in the water. So there's a sensitive marsh bird survey that we would potentially and hopefully implement in the spring, and coordinate these future surveys. So for at least the next 5 years during the spring and fall migrations. And like I had mentioned earlier as well, develop this basin-wide education program, similar to what the Kootenai bat program has done.
So can you just talk about the sensitive marsh survey? Sorry, I haven't heard of it.
Yeah, the sensitive marsh bird survey, so it's a North American protocol that's already been developed. So it wouldn't be as much work in that the protocol's already there and approved, and it's been used and implemented since the 90s. So it would just be basically taking that protocol and training people with that in the Columbia Valley and getting them to use that protocol to monitor these sensitive marsh bird surveys that wouldn't be captured during the Waterbird surveys, because you wouldn't necessarily be able to see them. They're much more secretive. You can really only hear them. So you do playback recordings and listen to their calls during sunset and sunrise. And thanks to the Columbia Basin Watershed Network, we've been accepted into the mapping program. So we have, using Google Earth, which is a pretty cool tool, but it's not nearly as amazing as ArcGIS, which is a really expensive program. So we've been able to acquire the use or the assistance of a co-op student from Selkirk College Geospatial Research Center, and she's going to be taking all of our points that we've mapped in Google Earth, transforming them or transposing them into ArcGIS, and then we've also already mapped out our polygons. So the pin mark kind of shows you where our site location is, and then the polygon or the shaded area will show you the site that is covered. But we're going to put all this into GIS, including additional shapefiles or map layers like wildlife management area, national wildlife area, agricultural land reserve, and private lands. And it'll enable us to, I think, learn a lot, but it'll especially be able us to see how much of the wetlands is being covered, how much are we missing, or should we be able, how many, where are gaps in our study area, basically. But I think it could be also useful for future stewardship programs in the Columbia headwaters. So I think it'll be a really useful resource. And we're going to get this really cool big printed out base map, as well as have the digital files. So, little quick quiz before I go, or before I sit down. So even whether you're a novice bird or an expert like Richard, there's kind of this cool technique that we found that people really didn't know, and I learned this at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. They've got these amazing training webinars on waterbirds, and yeah, even the expert birders that we've been training weren't aware that if you really just look for the color patterns in birds, in particular where you find the white patches on the birds, and you shade the rest as a black or a dark silhouette, then you are almost 100% of the time going to be able to know what bird you have. So knowing that, if you see this bird on the left, which is actually a male bird, it's not a female, even though it's very drab, you can just look at where the white is and then use the black and white color patterns on the right. What bird do you think we have? Here. I should have brought the
Bottom middle, whatever it says.
Yeah, so it's a gadwall. So it's pretty cool that you can use just, figure out, it's so hard sometimes. You have the worst visibility, bad weather conditions when you're out looking at these birds. Oh, that was another thing. We had horrible weather during the first 2 survey dates, which made it challenging as well. Weather, is always quite difficult with field work. But anyways, if you're able to see, where the white patches are, then this will be able you to identify what bird you have. And I got one more quiz for you guys. What are these 2 birds, or the pictures, the birds pictured in these 2 photos? Anyone?
Wood dog. Barrel's golden eye.
Barrels?
Close. So those are common golden eyes. They're much more common than the barrows. They look very much the same, except for a barrow's golden eye has a different white patch on the head. It's more rounded, and also the body is much less white, so it's more black with sort of these white spots, and they're much less common. And the bottom, these beautiful birds.
Harlequins?
Wood
I
duck.
can't see it. Are they wood ducks?
Wood ducks, yeah. So especially the males are probably the most well-ornamented bird that you could find in the wetlands. They're beautiful. So, thank you all so much. much. If you guys have any other questions, we're probably like 2 hours over time. Sorry, Tara. But I'm more than happy to answer them now or throughout the day. Okay.
Good job.
Thank you.